All right, everybody. So, just a quick discussion about our API and authentication, both current and what we're moving to for the API. So, currently with Connect One, we talk into Laravel and we're talking to the application framework. We're passing in a username and password or a credential, an email, and a secret or a password. Um, it's internally authenticating you against uh, tables in the database that Laravel framework talks to, and it's generating some kind of a token using some sort of a library inside of Laravel. Now, Laravel does have a product called Passport, which is a full-blown OAuth 2 provider server. We're not using that, I don't think, but it is possible to do a similar approach to what I'm going to propose, using this framework as well, but we're just not doing that. This is good enough for a web application because we authenticate the user. The framework uses this internal token for our View application that's talking to it back and forth, so that View can use that token for the life of the session of the user. So what we're talking about when we have the API and we have some code trying to utilize our API. So it could be JavaScript, web app, or it could be anything. It could be middleware from Cisco. They have an API that comes in, and we, not inside of our app, we reach out to the application framework in Laravel. They give us an email, we authenticate, we get a token, we return the token to them, and they use that token for the life of their session. So very similar to what we're already doing with Connect One. We're just doing it against an API. Now, alternatively, we could have an outside identity solution like OAuth or SAML, and it could be doing the authentication piece. It comes back, tells us that they're authenticated, and I think our app framework would still then generate the token that's being used. But we don't do that. So currently, the only thing we do is the basic authentication into Laravel. So the idea would be, instead of reaching out externally to an identity provider or to Laravel app framework, we would just simply internally use a library inside of Java that does what OAuth servers do and authenticate the person. It's a very simple single credential per company, so there won't be very many of them. We just keep track of them, in a config file or a table or something simple like that. So if we look at Connect 2, everything in the big box is a Spring Boot application, which is what our application is. We refer to it as Camel because the main library that we use inside of Spring Boot is Camel. We started out using Camel on JBoss, but we've moved to Spring Boot, and it's a good thing that we did. Things are a lot better now because Spring brings so much to the table. And here's a great example: is Spring is bringing us a Spring authentication server by just including these two libraries, Spring Security and Spring OAuth server. And once we compile those in, we can then just do our token, our authentication and token internally in our app. So we don't have to reach out and we don't have to rely on something exterior. It's a simple little one-off that can be contained within our app that's doing the API library for the small handful of credentials that we need to be able to use to tie into the person using the library. So they would reach in, send us an email and password. We'd hand out a token to them that's getting generated by this instead of an external thing. We could then, of course, stand up to the scrutiny that we're real OAuth because this is a well-known thing. So we could kind of hide behind, the fact that this is what we're using. We could communicate this to our members. It's always going to pass the checkbox people when they're asking us what we're doing for security. Now, the caveat here is all it's doing is providing a token, whereas the application framework gives us context as far as who is the company and who is the person. And since we don't really know who the person is that's going to be utilizing the API, and so they start invoking the API endpoints, and that person could even change, right? So we could have one session where they do different things as different users through the API, right? So it's not really a one-to-one like the app framework is meant to be. It's more of let us in and use your API and all of its capabilities. And so we have to add in, going through SQL into the database, who is the company that's correlated to the credential that they use to get their token, and then pick out an example person out of that company so that we have somebody that we're doing on behalf of that company, because a lot of the context of our business rules is company slash person. And so we need to track, kind of give me an admin or something out of your company. So when we're doing things as the API, behind the scenes, we're kind of doing it as that person, so to speak, if there's no end user context to what it is that we're doing. Right. So if the endpoint's not explicitly collecting who's doing a thing, creating a node, creating a request, but instead they're doing something like who is authorized, to interact with, like look up the department and forms and the different companies that I'm entitled to collaborate with. Well, we don't need the end user to be that person. That could be just this default person. So anyway, that's what we do today. So we might as well just sort of continue on that. I think it'll be a nice bridge from where we are today into the future, is to just internally identify a user in a company that's correlated to each credential that we hand out, and we just keep track of those elements someplace, so that when they present them to the front end, we tie them into a company person relationship. And yeah, there you go. That's, I think, where we're headed.